There's a specific action that creates immediate, visible change in how an avoidant person responds to you. Not change that takes weeks or months to manifest. Not subtle shifts that might be wishful interpretation, but obvious behavioral transformation that happens within hours or days of implementation. This action goes against every instinct screaming inside you when dealing with someone avoidant. It contradicts the advice to pursue harder, to prove your worth, to demonstrate your commitment. It also contradicts the advice to cut them off completely, to block them, to declare your boundaries through dramatic exit. What actually changes their behavior instantly sits in the uncomfortable middle ground between these extremes, requiring a specific type of response that most people cannot maintain because it feels unnatural and emotionally dishonest. The action is this: complete emotional neutrality in all interactions with them. Not cold withdrawal that punishes them for their behavior. Not warm pursuit that tries to draw them closer, but perfect, unwavering neutrality that treats them exactly as you would treat a casual acquaintance you have no particular feelings about. This neutrality disrupts the entire dynamic the avoidant person has constructed, short-circuits their defense mechanisms, and forces behavioral changes that emerge immediately because their usual patterns no longer function in this new environment. Understanding why this works and how to implement it reveals not just a technique for changing avoidant behavior, but insight into the fundamental mechanics of how avoidant attachment operates and what it requires to feel safe enough to pursue rather than withdraw. The psychological trigger that rewires their response. The avoidant person's behavior in relationships is governed by an internal system that constantly assesses threat level and adjusts their distance accordingly. This system operates automatically, outside conscious awareness, responding to environmental cues that signal safety or danger. The cues it responds to are specific and predictable. High emotional intensity from others signals danger. This person needs too much. This person will consume me. I must protect myself through distance. Pursuit signals danger. This person wants something from me. This person's happiness depends on me. I must create space before I'm trapped. Expression of hurt or disappointment signals danger. This person is making me responsible for their emotions. I must withdraw before guilt manipulates me into giving more than I want to give. These danger signals trigger the avoidant person's withdrawal behavior that causes so much pain to their partners. The withdrawal isn't personal rejection, though it feels identical to rejection from the receiving end. It's automatic defense against perceived threat to autonomy and selfhood. The avoidant person experiences the other person's emotional intensity, pursuit, or hurt as pressure that triggers fight or flight response. Since fighting in relationships means conflict and vulnerability they're equally desperate to avoid, they choose flight every time. This flight manifests as physical distance, emotional shutdown, reduced communication, or complete disappearance depending on severity of perceived threat. The system also responds to opposite signals, cues that communicate safety rather than danger. Low emotional intensity signals safety. This person doesn't need much from me. I can approach without risk of being consumed. Absence of pursuit signals safety. This person isn't trying to trap me. I have freedom to choose connection rather than having it demanded. Lack of expressed hurt signals safety. This person isn't making me responsible for their emotional state. I don't have to manage their feelings. These safety signals allow the avoidant person to approach, to initiate contact, to demonstrate interest and investment. The same person who withdrew when pursued becomes the pursuer when given space. The same person who shut down emotionally becomes emotionally expressive when pressure is removed. Understanding this system reveals why emotional neutrality creates instant behavioral change. Neutrality eliminates all the danger signals the avoidant person's system scans for while simultaneously communicating safety through what it doesn't contain. When you respond to an avoidant person with perfect neutrality, several things happen at once in their psychological processing. First, they register absence of expected emotional intensity. They anticipated that their withdrawal would trigger anxiety, hurt, anger, some strong emotional response that would confirm their narrative about relationships being emotionally overwhelming. Your neutrality contradicts this expectation completely. Second, they register absence of pursuit. The avoidant person's behavior typically triggers increased pursuit from partners, more texts trying to reconnect, more questions about what's wrong, more attempts to fix whatever problem they perceive caused the withdrawal. This pursuit confirms the avoidant person's fear of being trapped and triggers more withdrawal in self-reinforcing cycle. Your neutrality contains no pursuit, no attempt to close the distance they created, no effort to restore connection. This absence removes the trigger for continued withdrawal and actually reverses the dynamic, creating space where the avoidant person can consider approaching rather than needing to protect themselves through distance. Third, they register that you're not making them responsible for your emotional state. This is perhaps the most powerful element of neutrality's effect. The avoidant person carries deep, often unconscious anxiety about being responsible for others' emotions. This anxiety stems from childhood experiences where they learned that expressing needs or having emotional responses created problems, burden, or rejection. They developed avoidant attachment as strategy to avoid placing demands on others, while simultaneously avoiding others' demands on them. When you respond with neutrality, you communicate clearly that your emotional state is your own responsibility, that you're not looking to them to manage or fix your feelings, that they're released from the burden they always feared relationships would impose. The neutrality must be genuine rather than performed to create the psychological trigger that changes their behavior. The avoidant person's detection system for inauthenticity is highly sophisticated, developed through years of navigating relationships while protecting themselves from vulnerability. They can distinguish immediately between genuine neutrality and strategic coldness designed to make them feel guilty or punish them for withdrawing. Strategic coldness still contains emotional intensity, just in negative form. It still communicates that they have power to hurt you, that you're organizing your behavior around them, that they matter enough to warrant punishment through your coldness. Genuine neutrality contains none of this. It communicates that they're neither important enough to pursue nor important enough to punish. It treats them as fundamentally neutral presence in your life, someone you have no particular emotional investment in beyond basic human courtesy. This genuine lack of emotional charge is what their system cannot ignore or explain away. The avoidant person has extensive experience with partners who pursue them or partners who withdraw angrily. They have established responses to both patterns, but genuine neutrality is rare enough that their system has no established defense against it. The absence of familiar triggers leaves their defensive patterns with nothing to activate against. The psychological rewiring happens because neutrality forces the avoidant person to confront their own emotional reality without the distraction of managing yours. When you're pursuing them, they focus on your pursuit and their need to escape it. When you're hurt and angry, they focus on your emotions and either feel guilty or defensive. Either way, their attention is directed outward at your emotional state rather than inward at their own. Neutrality removes this external focus and leaves them alone with their actual feelings about you and the relationship. These feelings, which they've been avoiding through their defensive patterns, begin surfacing when there's no external emotional drama to distract from them. The avoidant person starts realizing they might actually miss you. They start noticing the absence of connection they took for granted. They start wondering whether they made a mistake in creating distance. These awarenesses are uncomfortable and unfamiliar because the avoidant person typically avoids feeling their feelings about relationships and losses. They stay busy, distract themselves, move on quickly to avoid the discomfort of missing someone or regretting their choices. But your neutrality creates an environment where their usual avoidance strategies don't work. You're not providing the emotional drama that would justify their withdrawal. You're not pursuing them in ways that would confirm their need for distance. You're just neutral, and this neutrality holds up a mirror that shows them their own feelings without any way to blame those feelings on your behavior. How complete emotional neutrality disrupts their system. Implementing complete emotional neutrality requires understanding exactly what it looks like in practice and what it doesn't look like. The distinction is crucial because most people attempting neutrality actually implement some version of cold, withdrawal, or wounded silence that still contains emotional charge. True neutrality is free of all emotional content, positive or negative. It treats the avoidant person with the exact same energy you'd give to a coworker you barely know, or a distant acquaintance you run into occasionally. Friendly, but not warm. Polite, but not engaged. Present, but not invested. This precise calibration is what makes neutrality so difficult to maintain and so powerful in its effects. Neutrality in communication means responding to their messages, if you respond at all, with minimal engagement and maximum brevity. When the avoidant person texts you, your neutral response doesn't ignore them completely, which would register as hurt or anger. But it also doesn't engage enthusiastically or extend the conversation. You respond with information that addresses their question or comment directly and adds nothing extra. No questions that invite continued conversation. No emotional content that reveals how you feel. No attempts to be funny or charming or connect beyond the minimal requirement of basic politeness. This creates deeply uncomfortable experience for the avoidant person because they're accustomed to their messages either being ignored by hurt partners or responded to with enthusiasm by pursuing partners. Your neutral response says something their system has rarely encountered. You're willing to interact, but you don't need or particularly want to interact. You're fine either way. Their presence or absence in your life registers as fundamentally irrelevant. This message is devastating to the avoidant person's ego in ways that angry withdrawal or eager pursuit never achieve. Anger says they matter enough to hurt you. Pursuit says they matter enough to chase. Neutrality says they don't matter enough to generate any strong feeling at all. The avoidant person's entire self-concept relies on knowing they have impact, that they matter to people even if they keep those people at distance. Your neutrality threatens this self-concept directly. Neutrality in person requires even more precise calibration. When you encounter the avoidant person in shared spaces or social contexts, you acknowledge them with the same energy you'd give any casual acquaintance. Brief greeting, polite smile. No, extended conversation, unless they initiate it, and even then, your participation is friendly, but minimal. You're not cold or hostile, which would communicate hurt. You're not warm or engaged, which would communicate continued interest. You're simply neutral, treating them as one of many people in the room, no more or less significant than anyone else present. Your attention doesn't track them. Your behavior doesn't change based on their presence or absence. You're genuinely indifferent in ways that read as authentic because they are authentic. The avoidant person's response to in-person neutrality is often visible and immediate. They expect you to either avoid them, which would confirm you're still hurt, or approach them eagerly, which would confirm you're still pursuing. Your genuine neutrality confuses them because it doesn't fit either pattern. They notice you're not avoiding them, but you're also not seeking them out. They notice you're polite, but not particularly interested in extended interaction. They notice your attention and energy flowing toward other people in ways it used to flow toward them. This observation creates discomfort that grows throughout the encounter. The avoidant person often attempts to get some emotional response from you during these neutral interactions. They might make jokes to see if they can make you laugh the way you used to. They might reference shared memories to see if you'll engage nostalgically. They might ask personal questions to see if you'll open up emotionally. Each attempt is a subtle test of whether the neutrality is genuine or strategic. Your response to these tests determines whether the neutrality continues disrupting their system or whether you reveal that you're still emotionally invested and the neutrality was performance. Genuine neutrality maintains the same energy regardless of their attempts. You might laugh politely at a joke without the warmth that characterized your previous laughs with them. You might acknowledge a shared memory without sentiment or extended discussion. You might answer a personal question briefly without reciprocating with questions of your own. The disruption neutrality creates in the avoidant person's system manifests as increased attempts at engagement from them. This is the instant behavioral change that neutrality produces. The avoidant person who was withdrawing and creating distance suddenly starts initiating contact more. They text more frequently. They seek you out in social settings. They try harder to engage you in conversation. They demonstrate interest and investment that was completely absent when you were pursuing them. This shift happens quickly, often within days of your implementation of genuine neutrality, because their system is responding to the removal of all the triggers that drove their withdrawal. The avoidant person experiences this shift as natural increase in their own interest and attraction. They don't consciously recognize that they're responding to your neutrality. Instead, they experience it as spontaneous realization that they miss you or made a mistake in creating distance. They feel drawn to reconnect, curious about what you're doing, motivated to reestablish connection. This feels to them like genuine emotion and authentic desire to reconnect. They have no insight into the mechanics driving these feelings. They don't understand that your neutrality created safety conditions that allow their attachment system to shift from defensive withdrawal to tentative approach. What makes this shift particularly striking is how it contradicts the avoidant person's stated preferences and behavior from just days earlier. The same person who said they needed space now seems to want closeness. The same person who was distant and unavailable now appears engaged and interested. The same person who made you feel like you were too much now acts like you're not enough, like they need more of your attention and energy than you're giving. This dramatic reversal happens not because the avoidant person has changed fundamentally, but because the environmental conditions changed in ways that trigger different behavior from their attachment system. The neutrality must be maintained consistently to continue producing this behavioral change. Any breakdown where you respond with warmth or hurt or anger immediately reactivates the avoidant person's defenses and causes them to withdraw again. This makes neutrality extremely difficult to sustain because their increased interest and engagement tempts you to respond with matching interest. When the person who is distant suddenly shows up with attention and warmth, every instinct pushes you to receive that attention eagerly and reciprocate the warmth. But doing so tells their system that the danger has returned, that you're pursuing again, that they need to re-establish distance to protect themselves. The immediate shift in their pursuit behavior, the most visible and immediate change in the avoidant person's behavior when confronted with genuine neutrality, is the reversal of pursuit dynamics. The person who was running away begins chasing. The person who needed space begins seeking closeness. The person who found your attention overwhelming begins competing for that attention. This reversal happens with striking speed, often manifesting within 48 to 72 hours of consistently maintained neutrality. The avoidant person who hasn't initiated contact in weeks suddenly sends multiple messages. The person who is unavailable suddenly has time and energy for interaction. The transformation is dramatic enough that it can feel surreal to anyone who spent weeks or months being made to feel like they were asking for too much. This shift in pursuit behavior follows predictable patterns. Initially, the avoidant person tests the waters with casual contact. They send a message about something neutral, a shared interest, something that reminded them of you, a question that seems innocuous. This first message is carefully calibrated to give them plausible deniability. They're just being friendly, just touching base, just thought you might be interested. There's nothing heavy or serious in the contact. Your neutral response to this message, brief and polite, but not engaging, triggers the next phase of their pursuit. When they discover that casual contact doesn't restore the dynamic where they control distance and you pursued closeness, the avoidant person escalates their efforts. The messages become more frequent. The tone shifts from casual to more personal. They start asking questions about how you've been, what you're doing, what's new in your life. They reference things they miss about the relationship or connection you shared. They make suggestions about getting together or doing activities you used to do together. Each escalation is testing whether your neutrality will break, whether they can trigger the emotional response or eager pursuit they're accustomed to receiving from you. The avoidant person's pursuit behavior reveals insecurities and needs they normally keep hidden. During the relationship, when you were pursuing them, they maintain position of being the desired one, the one with power, the one who was doing you a favor by giving you attention. This position protected them from vulnerability and maintained their self-image as independent and not particularly needy. Your neutrality strips away this protective position. Suddenly, they're the one trying to get response from someone who seems indifferent. They're the one initiating conversation with someone who responds minimally. They're the one hoping for engagement from someone who seems content either way. This role reversal is profoundly uncomfortable for the avoidant person, and their discomfort drives increasingly obvious pursuit. They might start commenting on your posts, something they rarely did before. They might reach out to mutual friends to ask about you, or engineer situations where they'll encounter you. They might become more direct in expressing that they miss you or want to reconnect. Each of these behaviors represents significant departure from their usual pattern of creating and maintaining distance. The behaviors emerge because their system is responding to the safety conditions your neutrality creates, while simultaneously experiencing anxiety that you're no longer available to them. The avoidant person begins experiencing feelings they typically avoid through their defensive patterns. They feel uncertain about where they stand with you, which is unfamiliar because they usually maintain certainty by keeping others uncertain. They feel vulnerable in reaching out without guarantee of positive response, which contradicts their usual strategy of only approaching when they're confident of warm reception. They feel competitive anxiety at the possibility that someone else might have your attention, which threatens their sense of having options while keeping you as backup. These uncomfortable feelings drive pursuit behavior that would have been impossible during the relationship when you were the one feeling uncertain, vulnerable, and competing for their attention. The intensity of their pursuit often correlates with how thoroughly you maintain neutrality. If you waver, if you show any signs of the eagerness or hurt they're probing for, their pursuit immediately decreases. The moment their system registers that you're still emotionally invested, that the neutrality was strategic rather than genuine, they retreat to their comfortable position of being pursued rather than pursuing. But if you maintain perfect neutrality, regardless of how much they pursue, their efforts intensify because they cannot find the familiar emotional response that would allow them to relax back into their usual pattern. What's crucial to understand about this pursuit behavior is that it's reactive rather than reflective. The avoidant person isn't pursuing because they've had deep realizations about your value or worked through their attachment wounds. They're pursuing because environmental conditions changed in ways that trigger different behavior from their attachment system. They're responding to your unavailability the same way you used to respond to theirs, with increased effort to restore connection and prove their significance to you. This parallelism reveals that their pursuit isn't necessarily more authentic or meaningful than your previous pursuit was. It's the same attachment anxiety expressed through same pursuit behavior, just in reverse roles. The avoidant person's increased pursuit creates powerful temptation to respond with warmth and engagement. This is what you wanted during the relationship, for them to show up, to make effort, to demonstrate interest and investment. Seeing them finally do these things feels validating and satisfying. Every instinct pushes you to meet their pursuit with your own, to reward their effort with enthusiasm, to finally have the mutual pursuit and engagement you always hope for. But responding to their pursuit with matching energy resets the entire dynamic. Their system registers that they've successfully restored the pattern where you're the one who's more invested, and they immediately begin withdrawing again to re-establish their comfortable distance. Maintaining neutrality in the face of their increased pursuit requires understanding that their behavior change, while immediate and visible, doesn't represent fundamental transformation. It represents situational response to change conditions. The avoidant person hasn't resolved the attachment wounds that drive their need for distance and control. They haven't developed capacity for sustained intimacy and vulnerability. They've simply shifted into a different phase of their attachment cycle, the phase where they pursue because they feel safe enough to approach while simultaneously anxious about losing access to you. This phase is unstable and will eventually shift back to withdrawal unless the underlying attachment patterns are addressed through sustained internal work that most avoidant people resist doing. Why this only works once and what that means. The power of emotional neutrality to instantly change avoidant behavior comes with a significant limitation. It only works once per relationship. Once the avoidant person has experienced your neutrality and understood it as strategy rather than authentic indifference, the technique loses its effectiveness. They develop immunity to it, learning to recognize the pattern and adjusting their responses accordingly. This limitation has profound implications for how neutrality should be used and what goals it can realistically serve. Understanding why it only works once reveals important truths about attachment patterns, behavioral change, and the difference between situational response and genuine transformation. The technique works the first time because it's unexpected. The avoidant person has never encountered this particular response from you. During the relationship, you pursued, expressed hurt when they withdrew, demonstrated that you cared about their behavior, and wanted more closeness. This pattern was predictable and comfortable for them, even if they found it suffocating. Your sudden shift to complete neutrality contradicts everything they learned to expect from you. This contradiction is what creates the disruption in their system and triggers the immediate behavioral change. Their attachment patterns have no established response to genuine indifference from someone who previously pursued them. But once the avoidant person experiences the neutrality and sees how they responded to it, they develop awareness of the pattern. If the relationship resumes after their pursuit brings you back together, and if it eventually deteriorates again according to their usual patterns, they'll remember what happened last time. When you implement neutrality a second time, they recognize it. They understand that your indifference is strategic technique designed to trigger their pursuit rather than authentic lack of interest. This recognition prevents the technique from working because their system no longer processes the neutrality as genuine environmental change requiring behavioral adaptation. The second time you implement neutrality, the avoidant person's response is completely different. Instead of experiencing it as loss of access that triggers anxiety and pursuit, they experience it as transparent manipulation that triggers defensiveness and withdrawal. They feel annoyed or contemptuous that you're using the same technique again. They interpret your neutrality as game playing rather than authentic boundary. They either ignore it completely, secure in their understanding that it's performance rather than reality, or they use it as justification for ending things permanently because they claim not to want relationship involving manipulation or strategy. Either way, the neutrality fails to produce the behavioral change it created the first time. This limitation means that neutrality should be implemented only when you're genuinely prepared to maintain it indefinitely, not as temporary strategy to get the avoidant person to pursue you again. If you use neutrality as manipulation to bring them back, then resume the relationship and fall back into old patterns. You waste the one opportunity where neutrality could have served as catalyst for genuine transformation. The technique becomes just another move in the dance between you, another cycle of pursuit and withdrawal, another example of the relationship's dysfunctional patterns rather than breakthrough that creates space for different dynamic. The fact that neutrality only works once raises a crucial question. What is neutrality actually for? If it cannot be used repeatedly to manage the avoidant person's behavior, what purpose does it serve? The answer is that neutrality isn't meant to be manipulation technique at all. Its value lies not in controlling the avoidant person's behavior, but in creating conditions where both people can see the relationship dynamics clearly and make authentic choices about whether and how to continue. Neutrality removes all the emotional noise that usually obscures these dynamics. The hurt, the anger, the pursuit, the defense, the guilt, the anxiety. What remains is clear view of whether compatible connection is possible between two people. When you implement genuine neutrality, you're not trying to make the avoidant person behave differently. You're establishing authentic boundary that says you're no longer willing to pursue someone who withdraws, no longer willing to manage someone else's emotional avoidance, no longer willing to accept breadcrumbs of connection while pretending they constitute nourishment. This boundary is sustainable because it's genuine rather than strategic. You can maintain it indefinitely because it aligns with your actual needs and self-respect. The avoidant person's response to this boundary reveals whether they're capable of showing up differently. If their response is to begin pursuing, to demonstrate interest and investment they didn't show before, this creates opportunity to evaluate whether their pursuit represents genuine capacity for different behavior or simply situational response to change conditions. This evaluation period is crucial. During the time when they're pursuing, while you maintain neutrality, you observe whether they're capable of sustained effort, whether they demonstrate any insight into their patterns, whether they take responsibility for their behavior, rather than blaming you or circumstances. These observations tell you whether continuing the relationship might lead to different outcomes or would simply restart the familiar cycle. Most avoidant people who pursue in response to neutrality are demonstrating situational response rather than genuine capacity for change. They're pursuing because conditions trigger their pursuit system, not because they've developed insight into their attachment patterns or worked on their capacity for intimacy. This means that if the relationship resumes, it will eventually return to the same dynamics that characterized it before. The avoidant person will begin feeling suffocated again. They'll start withdrawing again. The familiar pattern will reassert itself because the underlying attachment wounds haven't been addressed. The only difference is that you'll have used up the one time that neutrality could disrupt their behavior. This reality means the most valuable use of neutrality is not as technique to get the avoidant person back, but as boundary that allows you to move forward with clarity. You implement neutrality because you genuinely cannot continue pursuing someone who withdraws. You maintain neutrality because your self-respect requires it, not because you're trying to trigger a specific response from them. If they respond by pursuing, you evaluate their pursuit carefully to determine whether it represents genuine change or situational adaptation. In most cases, you'll conclude that it's the latter, and you'll maintain your neutrality and continue building life without them. The knowledge that neutrality only works once should prevent its casual or manipulative use. It's not a tool to be deployed lightly whenever the avoidant person withdraws, not technique to control their behavior through cycles of the relationship. It's last resort, the boundary you establish when you've reached the end of your capacity to accept their unavailability. It's the moment when you choose yourself over the relationship, when you decide that being alone is preferable to being with someone who keeps you at distance. This choice is what makes the neutrality genuine and powerful. It's also what makes the avoidant person's response to it meaningful data rather than temporary behavioral change. If you find yourself tempted to use neutrality strategically to manipulate the avoidant person into pursuing you, this temptation reveals that you haven't yet reached the place where neutrality would be genuine. You're still invested in changing their behavior, still hoping they'll become the partner you need them to be, still willing to employ strategy rather than establishing authentic boundary. This is understandable, but it means the neutrality will likely fail because it won't be authentic enough to bypass the avoidant person's sophisticated detection systems. Worse, it means you'll waste the one opportunity where neutrality could serve as genuine catalyst for clarity and change. The most empowering understanding about neutrality is that its value doesn't depend on how the avoidant person responds, whether they pursue or withdraw, whether they recognize their patterns or remain defensive, whether they show up differently or continue their familiar behavior. The neutrality serves you by establishing boundary that protects your emotional well-being and allows you to build life that doesn't revolve around someone else's emotional availability. The instant change in their behavior that neutrality often produces is almost irrelevant compared to the instant change it produces in your own life. The freedom that comes from releasing the burden of pursuing someone who doesn't pursue you back. The relief that comes from no longer organizing your emotional state around someone else's behavior. The clarity that comes from treating someone according to the actual relationship you have rather than the potential relationship you hope for. This is why neutrality only works once, and why that once is enough if it's used correctly. Not as manipulation of them, but as liberation of yourself.